Socialization theories have long been presented as being able to explain the differences between the sexes. The theories attribute gender differences between men and women to socio-structural power differentials, gendered socialization processes, and gender roles that affect androgynously gendered minds of boys and girls. Social role theories have largely been pushed by feminists in trying to explain why women are quote-unquote disadvantaged in societies around the world. In this video, we examine social role theories in the context of gendered roles, socialization, stereotypes, and the gender equality paradox. Lipp argues that the social role theory contains three components in the context of gender roles, that is, men are assigned economic duties while women are assigned homemaking duties. There are occupation-specific roles such as engineering and mechanics for men or nursing and teaching for women, and men occupy higher social statuses. The author maintains that according to the social role theory, gender socialization, social stereotypes, cognitive development, and cultural factors account for the differences between the sexes. These differences arise from role allocations based on physical variations, including greater male upper body strength, female gestation, and lactation. Schmidt and colleagues explain that according to the social role model, sex differences in personalities arise from socialization, that is, a culture's way of defining acceptable ways of behaving, feeling, and thinking for men and women. Eagley and Wood assert that in America, just like in most modern societies, women have lesser power than men because they have limited control to valuable resources. The authors argue that because of the patriarchy, women have a larger share of domestic labor and earn less because they are thinly represented in high positions. Also, organizational factors such as discriminatory employment practices, social factors such as men's greater ownership of capital, and cultural factors such as ideologies, legitimize gender inequality. According to Eagley and Wood, gender differences arise from socially assigned roles. Physical attributes, such as men having greater upper body strength, guides them into more strenuous jobs. Eagley and Wood argue that these physical attributes are less important in post-industrial societies where fewer occupations require such attributes. Women's childbearing responsibilities informs the societal allocation of related responsibilities, thereby making them less important in societies with low birth rates, less reliant on lactation for infant feeding, and relies on non-maternal childcare. Overall, physical, social, and ecological differences influence the roles allocated to the sexes because of efficiency. This efficiency is particularly useful in unions where men and women are allied in partnerships that require the division of labor. Eagley and Wood, however, suggest that men specialize in activities that generate wealth, status, and power that rise with the complexity of a particular society. Subsequently, men's concentration in power and status-generating roles produces dominant behavior and subordinate behavior for women. On the one hand, dominant behavior is assertive, autocratic, and controlling. On the other hand, subordinate behavior is compliant, less aggressive, and cooperative. Men and women acquire sex-specific skills that facilitate the adoption of social role requirements. For instance, women specialize in homemaking skills, while men learn skills valuable in the paid economy because of their providing role. Thus, the female adoption of the domestic role makes women facilitative, friendly, communal, and nurturing. The male adoption of providing behaviors makes men independent and assertive. Male-dominated professions are agentic, such as butcher, lumberjack, and roofer, while female-dominated ones are communal, such as teacher, nurse, and social worker. Therefore, gender roles arise from performing sex-typical productive works. The causes of sex differences are subsequently linked to social structures or the patriarchy, social breadwinner or homemaker roles, and the relevant gender ideologies. Baron Cohen points out that men are more likely to choose dominance-oriented occupations that emphasize social hierarchies and control, while women are more likely to choose dominance-attenuating jobs, for example working in teams and with the disadvantaged. Social roles are also associated with stereotypes that translate into sex differences, including men being assertive and agentic while women are expressive and submissive. The social role theory suggests that societies with strong gender roles report the largest differences between the sexes. Maccabee argues that there are very few gender differences in permissiveness, restrictiveness, monitoring, and responsiveness from parents when raising children. The author further suggests that assumptions around welcoming assertive behavior around boys and embracing emotional closeness for girls are not backed by scientific evidence. However, evidence supports the fact that parents do more roughhousing with sons, offer dolls to girls and trucks to boys, and are more likely to discuss feelings with girls than with boys. The question becomes, do parents offer or do children prefer toys? If roughhousing is more common with boys than with girls, is it based on the stereotypical perceptions or what boys' play looks like from infancy? Maccabee describes sex typing as individuals or children taking up attributes typical, valued, expected, or normative of their sex. Sex-typed behaviors become habits when examined through the stimulus-response principles that reinforce learning theories. Boys and girls adopt masculine or feminine behaviors based on what is reinforced by social agents, that is, parents, teachers, and older peers or siblings. Boys are shaped in a masculine way and punished if they act in a feminine way, with the vice versa being true for girls. For instance, if being masculine then means not crying, then the socialization pressures on boys imply that they are more likely, than girls, to be told, "Oh, toughen up. Don't be a crybaby, it's a minor scratch, or it is not that painful." Subsequently, boys are more likely to develop stronger crying inhibitions. Dressing children in specific colors, granting them more access to gender-specific toys, giving masculine and feminine names, and decorating children's room differently ensures that children are treated a certain way. According to Maccabee, the Oedipus complex of the psychoanalytic theory refers to the desire for sexual involvement with a parent of the opposite sex and a subsequent sense of rivalry with the parent of the same sex, which is very crucial in the normal development process. Resolving the Oedipal complex issues occurs at around age 5, where children identify with the same-sex parent and adopting the sex-typed characteristics of the same parent. Maccabee argue that resolving the Oedipal issues is more difficult for boys than it is for girls because they have to break their identification with the mother and subsequently become masculine by distancing themselves. The socialization theory suggests that boys and girls experience different socialization pressures and practices that inform different behavioral patterns. Encouraging boys and girls to engage in sex-oriented behaviors culminates in interest and activity differences later on in life. For instance, boys are taught independence from a young age, essentially cutting them off through the assignment of non-domestic chores, whereas girls are taught dependence through constant monitoring and assignment of domestic chores to facilitate the same. Based on the socialization theories, similar to the social role theory, societies with the greatest gender polarization in socializing boys and girls should record the greatest differences between the sexes. Social environmental factors include cultural and social factors such as status differences, social learning, socialization pressures, self-concepts, and stereotypes. Differences in treating boys and girls leads to the categorization of male and female behavior, which sets the societal standards of gender. For instance, Baron Cohen argues that a male child crying is associated with anger, while a female child crying is commonly linked to fear. Thus, the psychological sex differences, for instance, the presentation of men being more aggressive than women, result from gender expectations that individuals are exposed to from childhood. Baron Cohen points out that children spend more time with their mothers than their fathers, with children in cultures such as Kenya and Japan spending 3 times more time with the mother and India being 10 times. The question around parental socialization is two-dimensional. Are mothers responsible for socialization since they spend more time with children? Or do fathers interact with their sons and daughters differently? Boys receive more punishments, prohibitions, and threats compared to girls as an approach to controlling them. Fathers are less sympathetic with their male children's emotional dependency, while they are tolerant of their daughters' clinginess. As a result, boys are socialized to be independent, including emotionally, from a very young age. Could this be the reason why men experience difficulties expressing themselves and end up committing suicide at higher rates than women? Boys are not only welcome to be physical than girls, they are also more physically active from birth. Eagley, Beall, and Sternberg maintain that as early as the 2nd year of life, prior to actual socialization, children prefer gender stereotypical activities, for instance, girls hosting tea parties and rough-and-tumble play in boys. Baron Cohen suggests that girls have better self-control, and as such, they are less likely to require emotional outbursts from their parents. According to Eagley, Beall, and Sternberg, girls appear to be more responsive to their parents' socialization attempts. As early as the second year of life, girls embrace their mother's agenda more often than boys, complying with their mother's request eagerly, even when their mother is not around. Could this explain why boys grow up to be more assertive while girls are more submissive? Girls are also better at imitating their parents, especially mothers, thereby raising the incentive to socialize girls more than boys since they are less likely to require discipline. Baron Cohen suggests that parents do not differ in how they treat their children in the context of warmth, responsiveness, restrictions, and encouragement, thereby questioning the strength of sex typing as noted in the beginning of this section. Moreover, parents devote more time towards teaching boys to be empathetic and copying their facial expressions, thereby raising difficulty in correlating female superiority and empathy with socialization. However, mothers are more emotional with the words they use when addressing their daughters, which encourages more positive emotion. Maccabee observes that fathers show negative reactions to any effeminate behaviors from their sons. The social learning theory recently included learning by imitation, also called modeling, to the reinforcement aspects of socialization. The social learning theory suggests that children are shaped by direct positive and negative reinforcement. In addition, children also learn indirectly by seeing reactions to others' gender-appropriate or inappropriate behaviors. However, observational learning is limited by selective imitation, where boys and girls will only pick behaviors that are typical of their gender. The cognitive perspective of social learning challenges the perception of children as passive recipients of socialization pressures by presenting them instead as active. Over time, children have been observed as being able to adopt standards and subsequently regulate their own behavior. The increased availability of information has enabled children to gradually develop their own stereotypes. Gender being more binary for children implies that it is more salient and the underlying differences are biologically and socially redundant. Children's awareness of their gender identity affects how they observe others by selecting the experiences of others who they share biological characteristics, namely sex. The need to build consistency in cognition pushes children towards conforming to their own sex. The achievement of consistency is manifested through children classifying themselves by members of the same sex. Overall, children's independent socialization assumes three fronts. First, selectively imitating same-sex peers or models. Second, seeking, selecting, and remembering information that is relevant to a child's gender schemas. Third, ignoring, forgetting, and distorting information irrelevant to their socialization. Subsequently, gender differences among children assume three explanations. First, adults socialize their children. Second, children socialize each other based on how they are affected by different socialization agents. Third, children conform to the stereotypes of their own sex once they are aware of their gender identity. All in all, Maccabee explains that gender differences observed in children are based on socialization pressures and the coherence of their gender schemas, that is, knowledge surrounding the social expectations of their sex. Direct socialization influences are a major source of information upon which cognitive or indirect socialization is built. Stereotypes are often characteristics that present a certain degree of difficulty to measure. People's sex-based beliefs can be assessed objectively, but it is only restricted to individuals who have already been socialized, that is, adults. The establishment of gender stereotypes and self-concepts utilizes self-verification processes that guide behavioral differences between the sexes. The verification processes influence men's and women's approaches to completing personality tests, especially when evaluating gender-specific domains. Gender stereotypes portray some personality traits as desirable for a specific gender compared to others. The gender-related social desirability of some traits is in line with the gender artifact model, which suggests that men and women are more likely to embrace socially desirable traits. For instance, men are likely to denounce being fearful and more likely to embrace being assertive or dominant, while women are more likely to embrace being emotional, agreeable and less likely to embrace being dominant. Thus, personality differences between the sexes could be a reflection of stereotype-induced artifacts or the extent to which individuals compare themselves to their own sex, that is in-group comparisons, or to the opposite sex, or out-group comparisons. Eaglean would posit that gender stereotypic expectations affect behavior when they become internalized into individuals' self-concepts and personalities. In other words, gender roles impact self-regulatory processes. Guimond and colleagues argue that individual differences in the self-construct contribute to observable gender differences. For instance, men are more likely to value power, achievement, and self-direction, while women value benevolence and universalism. These differences in male and female preferences are more pronounced in cultures or countries that rank high in terms of equality. Sex differences are greater in Western individualistic countries compared to traditional collectivist ones, which contradicts the assertion that gender equality reduces gender differences. Self-construal is associated with gender differences across various domains, including values, personalities, emotion, and motivation. The sense of self is different from group stereotypes since it entails what is meaningful to an individual person. Guimond and colleagues assert, and I quote, "In individualistic cultures, the relevant dimension is agency, defined as concern with personal effectiveness and social dominance. In collectivistic cultures, however, the relevant dimension is communion, defined as a concern with personal integration and social connection. Women are more likely than men to develop an interdependent or relational self-construal, whereas men are more likely than women to develop an independent or agentic self-construal. The innate nature of the self-construct accounts for the self-reported differences between men and women by moving away from evolutionary and social theories. Gender differences in relational self-construal vary across cultures by increasing gender differences, more greatly in Western cultures. High-power distance cultures are characterized by rigid social hierarchies, with social comparison between groups being rare, thereby being restricted to intragroup or interpersonal levels. Comparisons for people belonging to different social groups is more common in low-power distance cultures. People in low-power distance cultures are more insecure compared to those in high-power distance cultures, including Malaysia. The theory of social comparison suggests that self-knowledge or perception is context-dependent. The self-categorization theory seeks to distinguish between the individual self or personal identity and the collective self or social identity through the argument that personal identity is founded on intragroup comparisons, that is, differences and similarities with other group members, while social identity is based on intergroup or outgroup comparisons. Thus, based on the theory, self-reported gender differences could arise from self-stereotyping, which could be greater in some people compared to others. Gender differences are observable when relational and agentic self-construals are obtained from those who compare themselves to members of the opposite gender, whereas the differences become small to non-existent when one compares themselves with their own gender. Women score higher in social comparison orientation, especially the intergroup orientation, which is greater in westernized individualistic cultures. The argument that social expectations of men and women influence their psychological functioning is often accompanied by the assertion that the occupation of similar social roles by men and women erodes the gender differences arising from socialization. In other words, predictions of the social role theory revolve around egalitarian societies having weaker gender roles and smaller psychological differences between men and women. According to Lipper, the variation of personalities across cultures, especially if the variability is affected by structural and economic factors, supports the likelihood of social role theories being accurate in accounting for personal differences. Social theorists suggest that most societies are patriarchal, which accounts for why studies document unidirectional sex differences, with the magnitude of these differences varying based on the underlying structural and ideological differences, including social attitudes, economic development, and the extent to which a society is patriarchal. The consistency of social roles and gender differences differ based on society. For instance, mate selection in masculine and developing societies adheres to traditional gender role expectations. Lipper highlights the fact that sex differences show consistency across cultures increases support for the biological perspective of these differences. Cross-cultural gender differences could arise from universally adapted gender roles. For instance, men's physicality, compared to women, informs undertaking physically intensive activities, including construction. Universal differences that are not affected by cultural variations render credit to biological theories regarding the gender differences between the sexes. Evolution-related behavioral patterns are sensitive to environmental factors, that is, certain behavioral responses are associated with environmental triggers. Stressed environments, including poverty and diseases, result in the adoption of restricted sexuality patterns, while these patterns are unrestricted for non-stressed environments. The predictions that egalitarianism eliminates differences between men and women are seriously challenged by findings associated with the gender equality paradox that exists in various cultures around the world. Guimond and colleagues suggest that sex differences in personalities, emotions, and values are weaker in societies with strong gender roles, while they are stronger in societies with weaker gender roles, that is, the gender equality paradox. The authors associate the gender equality paradox with social comparisons, that is, people in traditional societies are more likely to use in-group comparisons in comparing themselves with members of the same sex, while those in egalitarian societies compare themselves with members of the opposite sex, that is, out-group comparisons. The gender equality paradox is also reported by Costa and colleagues, who argue that it arises from attribution differences, that is, the fact that people in societies with strong gender roles attribute behavioral differences to the gender roles, whereas societies with weak gender roles attribute the differences to interpersonal predispositions. For instance, kindness by a woman in egalitarian societies is perceived as a reflection of her personality, while the same act in traditional societies is perceived as conforming to gender norms. In-group and out-group comparisons have largely been used to explain the gender equality paradox. However, the comparisons fail to account for the equality paradox in physical differences that are not necessarily based on self-reporting. Schmidt and colleagues explain that Western societies report greater gender differences in height and blood pressure compared to more traditional societies,